The coffee maker clicked off. I sat at my kitchen table with both hands around the cup, and I could still hear him. Not his voice exactly. The sound a microphone makes when someone taps it twice before they speak. That hollow thud, like a fist knocking on something empty. Gordon Hale tapped that microphone in front of 150 people, looked out at the backyard of a house I'd been paying for since I was 28 years old, and called me dead weight. His attorney told Russell what happened after I left. Russell told me, slow, the way he always delivered things he wanted me to hear with both feet on the ground. My father sat down at the kitchen table. Read the eviction notice once. Read it again. The third time, Russell said. Gordon's hands were shaking, and the paper made a sound against the wood like something thin tearing. The property owner's name was printed in bold 12-point type at the top of the page. Vivian Marie Hale. His daughter, the freeloader, the dead weight. I was sitting in my apartment in Decatur when Russell called. 1 bedroom, second-hand couch, a window over the kitchen sink that stuck if you didn't lift it at an angle. Not a big place. Not a place anyone would look at twice. But it was mine in a way that house in Lawrenceville never was, even though, legally, that one was mine too. The coffee was cold by the time Russell finished talking. I hadn't taken a sip. Here is how the party started. My father's driveway is long, curved, and lined with crepe myrtles that my mother planted the year they moved in. I pulled up behind a catering van I didn't recognize and counted the cars. They spilled past the driveway onto both sides of the street, parked on the grass shoulders tucked under the Bradford pears. I stopped counting at 40. This was not a dinner party. This was something else. I turned the engine off but didn't open the door. My bag sat on the passenger seat. Inside it, between my wallet and a pack of tissues, there was a manila envelope thick enough that the clasp barely closed. I adjusted the bag so the envelope sat flat. Then I got out. The music hit first. Somebody had rented speakers, the big standing ones you see at church cookouts, and they were pumping Southern rock across the backyard loud enough that I could feel the bass in the pavement under my sandals. The evening air smelled like hickory smoke and citronella, and through the side gate I could see the glow of string lights, the kind people hang for weddings. I walked through the gate, and 150 faces turned toward me. Not all at once. It rippled. The people closest to the gate noticed first, nudged someone, whispered. Then the next table. Then the next. And by the time I was 10 steps into the backyard, the conversations had thinned to almost nothing, and I could hear the speakers clearly, and I could hear my father's voice through the microphone, and I could see the banner. Goodbye Freeloader. Red block letters on white vinyl, strung between 2 metal poles that someone had driven into the lawn on either side of the makeshift stage. The letters were at least 2 feet tall, maybe 3, and the banner caught the string lights so the red looked wet, almost alive. My father stood at a folding table that served as a podium, microphone in his right hand, his left hand gesturing the way it always did when he had an audience. Gordon Hale, 59 years old, owner of a contracting company that hadn't turned a profit in 4 years, wearing a sport coat I'd seen him buy at Dillard's on a credit card that pulled from an account I funded. He was smiling. He did not stop talking when I appeared. He talked louder. Tonight, he said, and the speakers carried it across the yard, across all those faces, across the tables of barbecue and coleslaw and sweet tea. Tonight is about moving forward without dead weight. Applause. Not thunderous, not the kind you hear at a rally, but enough. Enough hands clapping. Enough people nodding. My sister Brooke stood to his right with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, wearing a white sundress she'd charged to a credit line that had my social security number on it, though I wouldn't confirm that for another 3 weeks. She nodded along like she'd rehearsed this, like she practiced the angle of her jaw in the bathroom mirror. Beside her, Tyler Whitfield, her fiancé, clapped politely, with the careful rhythm of someone at another family's event who doesn't want to be rude but doesn't quite want to be there. My mother sat at a table near the left side, hands folded in her lap, looking at a spot somewhere between her plate and the tablecloth. Connie Hale, 57, who had called me 6 months ago crying because the electric bill was 3 months overdue and she didn't know what to do. I'd set up the auto pay the next morning. She never mentioned it again. She didn't look up when my father said my name. Near the back, at a table by herself, a woman I didn't know sat with one hand around a glass of white wine. She had silver hair cut short and a posture that said she'd spent a career sitting in rooms where she was the most important person at the table. I would learn later that this was Margot Whitfield, Tyler's mother, and that she'd been watching my father with the same expression a woman uses when she's already decided something. But that night I only noticed her because she was the only person not looking at me. She was looking at him. "Vivian," my father said into the microphone. 59 years of practice made his voice sound like authority even when it was hollow. "Come on up here, sweetheart." I didn't move. My sandals pressed into the grass, and I could feel the moisture from the afternoon rain seeping through the soles. The hickory smoke was thicker near the stage, and it mixed with the scent of Gordon's cologne, the one he'd worn since I was a girl, the one I used to think smelled like safety. "We've got something for you to sign," he said, and Brooke handed him a document. He held it up so the crowd could see the front page. "Family Separation Agreement" was printed across the top in a font that looked like it had been chosen to seem official. My father set it on the podium table and produced a pen from his jacket pocket, the same Dillard's jacket, and he laid the pen on top of the paper and looked at me with the particular expression of a man who believes he has already won. I could feel Diana before I saw her, my best friend since graduate school, now an immigration attorney with a mouth sharp enough to open tin cans, standing near the bar with her phone held at waist height, the camera angled toward the stage. She'd arrived an hour before me and positioned herself where the light was best. Nobody noticed. Diana had a gift for being exactly where she needed to be while looking like she had nowhere in particular to go. The yard was quiet, 150 people, and not one of them spoke. The string lights buzzed. A dog barked somewhere on the next street over. My father waited. I walked to the podium. Not fast, not slow. I looked at the document. I looked at the pen. I looked at Gordon Hale, the man who had transferred his house, his commercial property, and 2 vehicles into my name 3 years ago because he needed to hide them from an IRS audit, and who had never once asked for them back because he'd forgotten he'd done it, because men like my father sign things without reading them and assume the world will arrange itself around their signature. The pen stayed on the table. Not a word left my mouth. My eyes moved across the crowd, and I took my time with it. Table by table, face by face. Some of them I knew. Cousins, neighbors, people from the church my mother attended every Sunday. Some of them I'd never seen before, and all of them had come to watch me be erased, to eat barbecue and drink sweet tea and watch Gordon Hale perform the ritual removal of his eldest daughter from the family he believed he'd built alone. The bag came off the chair. Strap over my shoulder, the manila envelope shifted against my hip. Then I turned and walked back across the yard, through the side gate, and out to my car without looking at any of them again. Behind me, I heard the microphone feedback whine, and then my father's voice, smaller now without the amplification of my presence in the room. "Well, that settles that." And the applause came back, louder this time, and someone whistled, and I heard a glass clink against another glass. I sat in the driver's seat for a full minute. The engine was off. The windows were up. The street was quiet except for the muffled thump of the speakers in the backyard. I pressed my palms against the steering wheel and held them there until the leather got warm. The passenger door opened. Diana slid in, dropped her bag on the floor, and pulled the door shut behind her. She didn't say anything right away. She just sat there, and I could hear her breathing, and I could hear my own. And for a few seconds, neither of us spoke, because there are moments that need a little silence before they can hold words. "Tell me you got it," I said. Diana held up her phone. The screen showed a paused video, the frame frozen on the banner, the red letters sharp against the string lights. Every word, every face, the whole thing from the moment he tapped the microphone. I reached into my bag and touched the manila envelope. The paper was cool and slightly rough against my fingertips, and the clasp was still fastened, and everything inside it was exactly where it had been when Russell Keene, my attorney, had handed it to me 2 days earlier. Certified copies, filed with the Gwinnett County Clerk of Superior Court. As real as the ground the house was built on. I did not open it. Not yet. I started the car and pulled away from the curb past the crepe myrtles, past the line of parked cars that belonged to people who had just toasted my removal from a family I had been quietly keeping alive for 3 years. "Not yet," I said to Diana, and my voice sounded strange to me, like it was coming from somewhere behind my own chest. They need to feel it first. Diana nodded. She set her phone face down on her knee and looked straight ahead through the windshield, at the road, at the ordinary houses and the ordinary trees and the ordinary Georgia night that had no idea what had just started. We drove south toward Decatur. Neither of us turned on the radio, the car filled with the kind of quiet that happens when two people know exactly what comes next and have agreed, without saying it, that this particular silence is the last still thing before everything moves. Diana dropped me off at my building and waited until I was inside before she pulled away. I could hear her tires on the asphalt through the lobby door, and then the sound faded. And then there was nothing except the hum of the elevator and the click of my keys in the lock and the stillness of an apartment that nobody else has been waiting in. I set my bag on the kitchen counter. The manila envelope sat inside it, undisturbed, its clasp still fastened. I left it there. I poured a glass of water from the tap, drank half of it standing at the sink, and then I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I pulled up the original transfer documents. They were in a folder on my desktop labeled Hale Properties, and I hadn't opened that folder since the month I created it. The first file was the deed to the house in Lawrenceville. The second was the title transfer for 2 vehicles, a Ford F-150 and a Lexus sedan. The third was the commercial property on Satellite Boulevard in Gwinnett County, where my father's contracting company had operated for the last 11 years. All 3 documents had the same date, and all 3 had the same new owner's name typed in the field where it mattered, Vivian Marie Hale. I remember the day he called. 3 years ago, a Tuesday in April, and I was sitting at my desk at Kessler Stern, the private equity firm in Buckhead where I'd worked since I was 25. My father's voice on the phone had a texture I'd only heard once before, the night my grandmother died. Tight. Controlled. The voice of a man trying to sound like a man who was not afraid. "I need your help," he said, and I leaned back in my chair because Gordon Hale did not say that sentence. Not to me, not to anyone. The IRS is looking at the company. They're going to audit, and if certain assets are in my name when they do, it gets complicated. He needed to move the house, the trucks, and the commercial property into someone else's name. Temporarily, he said. A few months, he said. Just until the audit passed. Consider it your inheritance early, he told me, and he laughed a little, the way he did when he wanted you to think something was small. I was 28. I trusted my father the way you trust the floor under your feet, not because you've tested it, but because it has always been there, and questioning it would mean questioning every step you've ever taken. So I signed the papers. I drove to the Gwinnett County Clerk's office on a Wednesday afternoon and filed them myself. And the woman behind the counter stamped each page without looking at me because she did this 100 times a week, and none of it mattered to her. It mattered to me. I just didn't know how much yet. I closed the laptop and sat there in my kitchen in Decatur at 11:40 at night, still wearing the sandals I'd worn to the party, and I thought about the woman who had signed those papers 3 years ago. She would have cried at that party. She would have searched the crowd for someone who would say stop. She would have called her mother the next morning and apologized for something she didn't do, just to keep the word family warm in her mouth. I wasn't that woman anymore, but I could feel her, somewhere behind my ribs, before I learned what my name was worth on a deed. Within weeks of signing those papers, the business started going under for real. The calls didn't come from my father. They came from my mother. The first one was on a Sunday morning. I was at the farmer's market on Ponce, standing in front of a table of peaches, and my phone rang, and Connie Hale's voice came through thin and cracked like a window with a rock through it. "The electric bill," she said. "It's 3 months. I don't know what to do, Vivian. He won't talk about it. He says it's handled, but the lights flickered twice last night, and I called Georgia Power, and they said we're on a list." I paid the electric bill from my car in the parking lot of the farmer's market. I sat there with the engine off and my phone balanced on the steering wheel, and I typed in the account number my mother read to me, and I set up an automatic payment so it would never lapse again. That was the first one. The mortgage came next. Then the insurance on both vehicles. Then the water. Then the gas. Then the property tax on the commercial building because my father hadn't paid it in 2 quarters and the county had sent a notice. I set up 12 auto payments in total, all pulling from a separate checking account. I told Diana. No one else. Not my mother because she never asked. Not my father because he would have turned it into something he could resent. The money left my account on the first of every month, and the family kept the lights on and the house warm and the trucks insured, and nobody talked about where any of it came from, because talking about it would have meant admitting that Gordon Hale was not the man he told everyone he was. That night, after the party, I opened the banking app on my phone for the first time in months and navigated to the auto pay tab. I counted the payments. 12. I did the math I had never done, not once in 3 years, because doing the math would have made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. $4,600 a month. Every month. For 36 months. The number sat on the screen, and I stared at it like a receipt that doesn't make sense until you realize it makes perfect sense, that every line item is something you chose to buy, and the total is just the cost of pretending that buying it would make someone love you. I set the phone down. I didn't close the app. I just left it there glowing on the table beside my glass of water while I sat in my kitchen and listened to the refrigerator hum and the occasional car pass on the street below and the sound of my own breathing, which was steady, which was even, which was the breathing of a woman who had just done the math on 3 years of invisible labor and found the sum to be exactly what she had always suspected. Not enough. Not enough to matter. Not enough to be remembered. Not enough to stop a man from holding a microphone in front of 150 people and calling her dead weight while she paid for the electricity that powered the speakers. It happened slowly, the story Brooke told. Not all at once. She didn't walk into a family dinner one night and announce that I was a burden. She did it the way water wears a stone, one drop at a time, over years. The first comment I remember was at Thanksgiving, 2 years ago. Brooke was 25 then, and she just started dating Tyler Whitfield, and she was performing a version of herself that she thought the Whitfield family would approve of. Confident. Put together. The kind of woman who noticed other people's failures because she was too successful to have her own. "Vivian, did you bring anything?" she asked loud enough for the table to hear, as I walked in with a casserole dish I'd spent 2 hours on. "I'm holding it," I said. "I meant to the family," she said, and smiled. "You know, in general," my father laughed. My mother looked at her plate, and the table moved on, because that's what tables do when someone says something sharp in a sweet voice. They absorb it. They file it away. They let it become part of the air. Over the next 2 years, Brooke said it in a dozen different ways. Must be nice to just show up. I wish I could afford to contribute nothing. Some of us actually help. Each time my father nodded, because the story protected him. If I was the one who gave nothing, then he was still the one who gave everything. If I was the freeloader, then the money appearing in his accounts every month was his own, rerouted through some banking process he didn't need to understand. My mother heard every comment and corrected none of them, because correcting them would have meant saying where the money came from, and saying that would have cracked the silence she lived inside like a shell. By the time the party happened, the story was solid. Everyone believed it. The banner wasn't a surprise to anyone in that backyard except me, or so they thought. 3 weeks before the party, I was sitting at my desk at Kessler Stern running a quarterly valuation model when my phone buzzed against the desk. I picked it up with my left hand, still typing with my right, the way you do when you're deep enough in a spreadsheet that the world outside it feels like a rumor. Credit alert. Capital One Fraud Monitoring. A charge of $2,800 at a bridal boutique in Buckhead. I had not been to a bridal boutique in Buckhead or anywhere else. I set the phone down, picked it up again, opened the Capital One app, and pulled the full statement, scrolling with my thumb while my coffee cooled beside the keyboard. The charges scrolled like a timeline of someone else's life. A Nordstrom purchase for $812 in January. A spa in Virginia Highland, $400 in February. A lease deposit for a BMW, $1,500 in March. A second Nordstrom charge. A third. A restaurant in Midtown I'd never been to. A florist. A hair salon. 17 months of purchases that followed a pattern so obvious it was almost insulting. The charges appeared in waves. 3 or 4 in a cluster, always in the same part of town, always in stores I'd never visited. Each charge had a timestamp. I cross-referenced the dates against my own calendar, which I kept color-coded and synced across devices because that's the kind of person I am. The kind of person who ends up as a financial analyst at a private equity firm because she finds comfort in numbers and order and things that add up. On every single date, I had been somewhere else. At my desk. At the gym on Claremont. At Diana's apartment. Nowhere near Buckhead. I opened a notes app and began screenshotting. One by one. Date, amount, merchant, location. I saved each one to a folder I created on the spot and labeled with today's date. I did not call Brooke. I did not text my mother. I did not mention it to anyone at the office because the woman sitting at that desk in Buckhead with the cooling coffee and the scrolling charges was a financial analyst, and financial analysts do not react to data. They collect it. That evening, I called Russell Keene. I'd retained him 2 months earlier, quietly, for the property situation. Real estate and asset protection. He had an office on Church Street in Decatur, and he spoke in the flat, careful cadence of a man who had spent 20 years reading contracts and had learned that the most important words were always the ones people tried to hide in the middle of a paragraph. I need a timeline, I told him, for the credit fraud, and I need it to be airtight. How far back does it go? He asked. 17 months. The line was quiet for a moment. That's not impulse, Russell said. That's a system. He paused. Bring me everything. 2 days later, Russell's office. The morning light landed on a conference table covered in my paperwork. Property deeds on the left, credit statements on the right. Russell sat across from me with his reading glasses on and a yellow legal pad angled toward him. The property deeds are clean, he said, not looking up. Transfers filed correctly with the Gwinnett County clerk. Standard quitclaim, properly executed, properly recorded. There is no legal mechanism for your father to reclaim these assets without your written consent. And the credit fraud? Russell took off his glasses. 17 months of documented unauthorized charges from a single user who had access to your credit line. The pattern is consistent. The amounts are trackable, and the merchant locations don't match your verified whereabouts on any of the dates in question. He set the glasses on the table. This meets the threshold for a formal fraud report under Georgia law. If you want a file, I can have it ready by end of week. I looked at the stacks of paper. The deeds on one side, the theft on the other. My family's house, my family's money, my family's lies, all laid out in clean columns on a conference table in Decatur. I want to know how much time I have, I said. Before they realize. Russell leaned back. They will never realize on their own. They do not know what they do not own. The sentence landed on the table like a document. Flat. Final. True. I drove home and let Diana in when she knocked at 3 in the afternoon. She'd brought Thai food from the place on Ponce, the one with the green curry that tasted like someone's actual grandmother made it, and we sat on my couch with the containers between us, and she said, I need to tell you something I heard at the party. Such a now. She'd been standing near the bar when Brooke walked past with a woman I didn't recognize. One of Brooke's friends from her spin class or her bridal group, or one of the interchangeable social circles she moved through like costume changes. Brooke was 3 drinks into the evening and her voice had that loose quality it got when she forgot to perform. I told Dad it should be a party, Brooke said to the woman. Make it public. She won't fight back if everyone's watching. Diana repeated the words exactly. She had a lawyer's memory for language. Each syllable arrived in my kitchen like evidence. I set my fork down. I looked at Diana. I know, I said. Diana blinked. You told me 2 weeks ago. The look on her face was the first real surprise I'd seen all week, because Diana had been carrying this information since the party, thinking she was delivering a revelation, and instead she was delivering a confirmation of something I'd already absorbed, processed, and built a plan around before I ever set foot in that backyard. 2 weeks before the party, on a Wednesday night, Diana had called me, not texted, called. Her voice had that velocity it gets when she's trying to be calm and failing. Look at Brooke's Instagram story, right now. I'd opened the app on my couch, still in my work clothes, shoes kicked off, a glass of water on the coffee table. Brooke had posted a screenshot of a text conversation with the print shop. The message showed a banner mock-up. Goodbye Freeloader. Red letters on white vinyl. The print shop had replied with the price quote and a turnaround time. Brooke had posted it to her story, probably by accident, probably while she was switching between conversations, and it had been live for about 3 hours before she caught it and deleted it. Diana had screenshotted it. She sent it to me while we were still on the phone. I stared at the screenshot for a very long time. I could hear Diana breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for me to react, waiting for pain or outrage, or something that looked like a woman finding out her family had been building a stage to destroy her. But I had been paying their mortgage for 3 years. I had been covering their car insurance and their utility bills and their property taxes while Brooke charged designer handbags to my credit line and called me a freeloader at the Thanksgiving table. The banner was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. It was the last piece of evidence in a case I'd been building without knowing I was building it. The final line in a ledger I'd been keeping in a part of my brain. I didn't visit often because visiting it meant admitting that the column labeled love had been empty for a very long time. I sat with it for a full day. I didn't call Russell. I didn't call my mother. I sat in my apartment and I went to work and I came home and I sat in my apartment again, and somewhere during that second evening the decision settled into my body the way a fever breaks, not with a moment, with an absence. The hoping stopped. I called Russell the next morning. I called Diana that evening. I'm going to that party, I told her. Vivian, I need to see it. I need to stand there and watch him do it. Because if I don't, some part of me is always going to wonder if they would have actually gone through with it. I need the wondering to stop. Diana was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I'll get there early. I'll bring my phone. She understood. She didn't agree exactly, but she understood. The way only a person who has watched you write checks to people who don't know your handwriting can understand that sometimes the only way to stop is to stand in the room where the truth lives and let it hit you with all the lights on. So when I walked into that backyard, I knew about the banner. I knew about the speech. I knew my father was going to stand in front of 150 people and call me dead weight, and I walked in anyway, with a manila envelope in my bag and my best friend already positioned near the bar with her phone recording. I went to the party to watch my family erase me, and I went because I needed to feel it in my own body. Because 3 years of canceled checks and unanswered gratitude had built a wall of maybe between me and the truth, and maybe they don't mean it, and maybe next Thanksgiving will be different, and maybe if I just keep paying, eventually someone will turn around and see me. The party was my way of burning the maybe down. If they could do this in front of everyone, with a banner, with a microphone, with my mother sitting there looking at her hands, then the maybe was dead, and I could stop keeping it alive. I picked up my fork and ate the green curry. Diana watched me for a moment, then picked up hers. Neither of us said anything for a while, because some conversations end not with a conclusion, but with a mutual understanding that the conclusion happened a long time ago, and the words are just catching up. After Diana left, I drove to the commercial property on Satellite Boulevard. It was a single-story building with a flat roof and a sign that read, Hail Contracting in faded blue letters, though the building was no longer Gordon's in any way that mattered. It was mine. I had the key because Russell had arranged it. I let myself in through the side door, into the smell of sawdust and old carpet and the staleness of a place where nobody has opened a window in weeks. The front office looked exactly as I'd expected. A desk, a computer from 5 years ago, invoices stacked in a tray. But in the back office, behind the desk my father used when he came in, there was a filing cabinet. Old. Metal. The kind with the lock built into the top drawer and a keyhole that hadn't been touched in years, because the grime around it had formed a ring like a scab. The cabinet was olive green, and it didn't match anything else in the room, and it looked like it had been there since before the current furniture, since before the current carpet, since before the current version of the company. I tried the top drawer. Locked. I pulled out my phone and texted Russell, There's a locked filing cabinet in the commercial property. Can I open it? His reply came in under a minute. It's your property. Everything in it is on your premises. Yes. I put the phone away. I looked at the cabinet. I didn't have the key, and I didn't have a locksmith's number, and it was almost 9 at night. I'd come back. But I ran my fingers along the top of the cabinet, across the dust, and the thin scratch marks where something had been set on top of it years ago and dragged off. And I had the feeling you get when you open a closet door in a house you thought you knew and find a room behind it. There was something in there. I didn't know what. But the dust on the lock told me nobody had opened it in a very long time, and the fact that it was locked at all told me somebody at some point had wanted what was inside it to stay hidden. I drove home. My phone rang as I was pulling into the parking lot at my apartment, my mother's name on the screen. I let it ring 4 times, 5, 6, and then I answered, because some part of me still believed she might say something true. Vivian. Her voice was the voice she used when she wanted me to know she had made an effort to call. Careful. Measured. The voice of a woman walking across a frozen pond, testing each step. Your father was upset. You know how he gets. Maybe if you just called him. I waited. I gave her room. I gave her the silence that people fill with the truth when they're brave enough to reach for it. Family is family, Vivian, she said. There it was. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, not a single syllable about the banner, the microphone, the 150 people who watched her husband call her daughter dead weight while she sat at a table and looked at her hands. Just the sentence she always used, the one that sounded like love if you didn't listen too closely, the one that meant, please stop making this difficult for me. Yes, I said, it is. I hung up. I sat in my car in the parking lot with the engine ticking as it cooled and the street light making a pale circle on the hood, and I knew the way you know your own address, that I had just picked up the last phone call I would ever take from that number. 1 week after the party, Russell called me at work. I was between meetings, standing in the hallway outside a conference room with a coffee I hadn't tasted and my phone pressed to my ear. And Russell's voice had that flatness it took on when he was delivering facts that contained their own consequences. Your father hired an attorney, he said, Harold Dempsey out of Lawrenceville. He filed a petition this morning in Gwinnett County Superior Court to reverse the property transfers. I leaned against the wall. A colleague walked past and nodded, and I nodded back with the reflex of someone whose face was doing one thing while the rest of her was doing something else entirely. On what grounds? Temporary arrangements made under duress. The petition claims your father transferred the properties to you as a short-term measure during a financial audit, and that the arrangement was always intended to be reversed. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my father had just filed a legal document admitting, in writing, to a judge in the state of Georgia, that he had transferred major assets to avoid an IRS audit. He thought he was filing a weapon. He had filed a confession. How strong is it? I asked. The petition itself is weak. The transfers were properly executed, properly filed, and there's no written agreement stipulating their temporary nature. But, Vivian. Russell paused, and I could hear him choosing his next words the way a man chooses where to place his feet on ice. By putting this claim in front of a court, your father has created an official record of why those transfers happened. If the IRS ever looks at this, and they might, he's handed them the paper trail to his own tax fraud. I stood in that hallway, and I thought about my father sitting in Harold Dempsey's office, leaning forward with that posture he used when he wanted someone to believe he was in command, signing the petition without reading it carefully. Gordon Hale signed things without reading them. It was how I ended up with his house. It was how he would end up losing everything else. That evening, I opened the family group chat on my phone. I hadn't left the group. I hadn't muted it. I just read it like a weather report for a city you no longer live in, with the distant interest of someone who knows the storm is coming but won't be standing in it. Brooke had posted 4 photos from a bridal shower. White and gold decorations. A cake shaped like a ring. Brooke in the center of every shot, smiling, Tyler's arm around her waist, both of them tilted toward the camera at the angle that Instagram had taught an entire generation was the angle of happiness. The shower had been at a restaurant in Buckhead, and the deposit, I knew, had been charged to my credit line because everything Brooke did that cost money had been charged to my credit line for 17 months. Below the photos, my father had typed a message. Family meeting Sunday. Vivian's situation handled. My mother had replied with a heart emoji. I stared at that heart for a long time. A red heart, the default one, sent without comment, without a single word attached. My mother had watched her husband call me dead weight in front of 150 people, and a week later her contribution to the conversation about my erasure was a small red shape on a screen. Connie Hale's love had always been a thing she expressed in shapes rather than sentences, in hearts that cost nothing, because they asked nothing and changed nothing, and meant, in the end, exactly what they cost. I closed the chat. They were planning a Sunday meeting about a war that was already over. They just didn't know who had won it. The next morning, I called the locksmith Diana had recommended, a man named Paul who worked out of a van in Lilburn and didn't ask questions as long as you could prove the property was yours. I showed him the deed on my phone, and he followed me to the commercial property on Satellite Boulevard. And at 9:15 on a Thursday morning, he knelt in front of the olive green filing cabinet in the back office of Hale Contracting and picked the lock in under 2 minutes. The top drawer opened with a sound like a seal breaking. The air that came out was old and dry, the smell of paper that had been sitting in the dark for a very long time. I pulled the drawer all the way out and looked inside. Tax filings from the early years of the company, back when the business was new enough that the numbers were still small. Receipts from suppliers. A stack of canceled checks held together with a rubber band so old it crumbled when I touched it. And underneath all of it, at the bottom of the drawer, a manila folder. Thicker than the rest. The tab was blank. I lifted the folder out and set it on my father's desk. I opened it. The first document was a partnership contract. 2 pages, typed, dated 31 years ago. 2 signatures at the bottom. The first was Gordon Hale, in the sharp, forward-slanting handwriting I recognized because I'd grown up watching it sign birthday cards and permission slips and, eventually, the transfer documents that put his house in my name. The second signature I had never seen before. Rounder, smaller, careful. Helen Hale. The contract was simple. Equal partners. 50-50 ownership. Gordon Hale and Helen Hale, doing business as Hale Contracting, formed for the purpose of residential and commercial construction in the state of Georgia. Behind the contract, a stack of canceled checks from an account at SunTrust Bank, all written in the same round handwriting, all payable to Hale Contracting LLC, all dated within the first 2 years of the company's existence. Capital contributions. Helen Hale had put money into this business. Real money. Check after check, month after month, in amounts that would have been significant for anyone but enormous for a woman in her early 30s 30 years ago in Georgia. And at the very bottom of the folder, underneath the checks and the contracts and the yellowed receipts, there was a photograph. 4x6, slightly curled at the edges, printed on the glossy paper they used in the 90s. 2 people standing in front of a construction site, both in hard hats, both smiling. A man and a woman, and the man was my father younger, thinner with hair, and the woman beside him was someone I had never seen in any family photo, never heard mentioned at any dinner table, never encountered in any story my father told about how he built his company from nothing. I turned the photo over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written 2 words and a comma. Hale and Hale, Day 1. I stood there in the back office of a building that belonged to me, holding a photograph of 2 people who had started something together 31 years ago, and one of them had been erased. Not killed. Not lost. Erased. Removed from the story so thoroughly that his own daughter had never heard her name. Helen Hale, my father's sister. And he had called her a freeloader. The same word. The same man. The same trick performed 30 years apart on 2 different women who had made the same mistake. They had helped him. And they had trusted him to remember. I put everything back in the folder. I took the folder with me. I locked the building and drove home with the photograph on the passenger seat where Diana had sat the night of the party, and the whole drive back to Decatur. I kept glancing at it, at the 2 faces smiling in the Georgia sun at the woman I had never known existed. That night, I called Russell. I need you to find someone for me, I said. Helen Hale, Gordon's sister. Russell was quiet for a beat. I didn't know he had a sister. Neither did I. After I hung up, I opened my banking app. The auto-pay tab was still there, still showing 12 active payments. Still pulling $4,600 a month from my account, into the accounts of a family that had just filed a legal petition to take my property away from me while celebrating my removal from their lives with a heart emoji and a Sunday meeting agenda. I pressed cancel all. The screen asked me to confirm. I pressed confirm. The 12 payments turned gray, one after another, like lights going out down a hallway. When the last one went dark, the screen showed a message. All scheduled payments have been canceled. In 5 to 7 business days, the first bills would bounce. The mortgage would miss its cycle. The car insurance would lapse. The utilities would send warnings, then notices, then threats. My family would start making phone calls, first to the bank, then to each other, then, eventually, to me. And none of them would understand what had happened because none of them had ever known where the money came from, because knowing would have meant looking at me and seeing something other than dead weight. I set the phone on the table and picked up the photograph. Gordon and Helen. Day 1. I thought about my own day 1, the morning I drove to the Gwinnett County clerk and filed the transfer documents and then set up the first auto payment in my car in the parking lot of a farmer's market, with the smell of peaches coming through the open window. I wondered if Helen had a day 1 too, a morning when she signed her name on a contract and believed it would mean something, believed her brother would remember who built the floor he was standing on. I didn't cry, but I propped the photograph against the salt shaker on my kitchen table and I looked at it for a long time and I kept it there when I went to bed and it was still there in the morning, facing the window catching the first light. 3 days later, the mortgage bounced. I was at my desk at Kessler Stern when the notification came through. I'd set up an alert on the account before I canceled the auto pay, so I would know the exact moment the first domino tipped. My phone lit up on the desk beside my keyboard. I picked it up, read the notification like any data point, a number that meant something to someone, but not to me, not anymore, and set the phone face down on the desk. I went back to the model I was building, a 12-month forecast for a logistics company in Marietta, and I worked on it for the rest of the afternoon without checking my phone again. That evening, I made dinner in my apartment. Rice and vegetables, nothing complicated, a meal for hands that need to be busy while the mind goes somewhere else. My phone was on the counter. At 6:14, it rang. My mother's name on the screen. I watched it ring. At 6:21, it rang again. At 6:38, again. 7 calls in 2 hours. I never moved toward it. The phone sat on the counter and rang, and went to voicemail and rang again. And I stood at the stove stirring rice and listening to the sound of it, the way you listen to rain when you're inside and dry, and the rain has nothing to do with you anymore. When the ringing finally stopped, the silence in the apartment was different from the silence that had been there before. Louder, like the silence after a church bell, when the air is still shaking but the sound is gone. 2 days later, everything else started to go. The car insurance lapsed first, then a utility warning. Then Gordon's business received a late payment notice on the commercial property, the building I owned, and according to Russell, my father called his bank in a fury, convinced there had been a system error. The bank told him the payments had originated from an external account that had been disconnected. He demanded to know whose account. They couldn't tell him. He called everyone he could think of, and none of them had answers. The money had arrived like oxygen, invisible and essential, and now it was gone. While all of this was happening, I was at my desk, running models, answering emails, eating lunch at my desk from a container I packed that morning. I checked the notification log once, around 2 in the afternoon. 3 bounce payments confirmed. I closed the tab and went back to work. Doing nothing was the strangest thing I had done in 3 years. For 36 months, I had been absorbing costs that no one acknowledged, watching numbers leave my account like a monthly apology for the crime of being someone they could use. Sitting at my desk, letting the phone ring, letting the bills fail, felt like standing up after carrying something heavy for so long I'd forgotten I was carrying it. My shoulders ached. But the weight was gone. Russell called me the following Monday. I met him at his office on Church Street, the same conference table, the same tall windows, but this time the light was different later in the day, and it cut across the table at an angle that divided my paperwork into shadow and gold. The eviction notices have been served, he said. Residential and commercial. Under Georgia law, your father has 60 days to vacate both properties. And his petition. Still pending, but it has a fatal flaw. His own filing admits the transfers were made to avoid a tax audit. If this goes in front of a judge, the judge will see a man who moved assets to evade the IRS and is now trying to reclaim them. That's not a sympathetic position. Russell turned a page in his legal pad. There's something else. I waited. I found Helen Hale. A jumper, the name landed on the table like it had landed on the photograph. Quiet, heavy. She's alive, Russell said. She lives in Savannah. She's 62. She works as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. He looked at me over his glasses. I called her. She picked up on the first ring. He paused. She said she's been waiting for this call for 30 years. Something moved in my chest when he said that. Not pain, exactly. Something closer to recognition. The feeling of meeting someone you already know. Can she still file? I asked. After 30 years? Russell set down his pen. Your father never formally dissolved the partnership. There is no dissolution filing with the Georgia Secretary of State. Under Georgia law, the partnership still exists. Helen is not filing a new claim. She is asserting rights she never lost. He leaned forward, his concealment of the records, locking them in a building he no longer owns, that constitutes fraudulent concealment, which tolls the statute of limitations. She doesn't need to prove she was wronged 30 years ago. She needs to prove the partnership still exists. And it does. He never ended it. He just stopped paying her. I drove to Savannah on a Saturday, 3.5 hours south through middle Georgia, with the windows cracked and the photograph from the filing cabinet in my bag. Helen's house was small, white clapboard, a garden in the front yard that looked like someone had been tending it for decades, with azaleas along the walk and a row of daylilies by the mailbox that were just starting to bud. The porch had 2 rocking chairs and a side table with a glass of sweet tea on it. The ice mostly melted, like she had been sitting there waiting and had gone inside when she heard my car. I knocked. The door opened, and a woman stood in the frame, 62 years old, thin. Her hair was silver and cut short close to her head, practical, and she had my grandmother's cheekbones. The same high line I saw in old photos in my mother's closet, but never on the mantel where my father kept his version of the family. She looked at me for a long moment, not surprised, not wary, the look of a person who has been expecting a knock and has rehearsed nothing for when it comes. You look like him, she said, and then, quieter, but you have your grandmother's eyes. She invited me inside. The house was cool and neat and smelled like lemon furniture polish and something baking, though I never found out what. We sat at her kitchen table, which was round and wooden and scarred with the marks of years, and she poured me a glass of tea without asking if I wanted one, because in Savannah, offering tea is not a question. I set the photograph on the table between us. Helen looked at it. She didn't pick it up right away. She just looked at it, the way you look at something you lost so long ago that finding it again doesn't feel like recovery. It feels like archaeology. Then she reached out and touched the edge of the photo with one finger. Hail and hail, she said. Day 1. She told me the whole story, not fast, not slow, in the measured cadence of someone who has told it to herself 1,000 times and is finally saying it out loud in a room where someone else can hear. 31 years ago, Helen and Gordon started the company together. She handled the books, the permits, the insurance, the payroll. He handled the clients, the handshakes, the schmoozing, the part of the business that happened in front of other people. They were good at different things. And for the first few years, the company worked because they were different, and the difference was the engine. But when the money started coming in, Gordon started rewriting. He told clients Helen was just helping out. He introduced her at job sites as my sister who does some of the paperwork. He removed her name from new contracts without telling her. He started holding meetings she wasn't invited to. And when she confronted him, he said the words that I would hear 30 years later in a different room, aimed at me. You don't contribute. You never have. I built this. You just showed up. He called her a freeloader. When Helen said that word, I flinched, a small thing, a tightening in my jaw, but she noticed. She stopped talking for a moment and looked at me across the table, and something passed between us that didn't need language. She knew. She could see it in me the way I could see it in her. The same wound, the same word, the same man. She was pushed out within a year. Gordon kept her equity share. He told the family she left because she couldn't handle the pressure. Told my mother that Helen had problems and it was best not to bring it up. Within 5 years, Helen was gone from the family entirely. No photos on the mantle. No name at Thanksgiving. No mention in any story Gordon told about building his company from nothing alone, with grit and willpower and the conviction that permits a man to erase the woman who built the floor he stands on and take credit for the view. Helen moved to Savannah. She got a job as a bookkeeper. She lived quietly. She kept one thing. She left the table and came back with a fireproof box, black metal with a combination lock. She opened it. Inside, the original partnership contract. A stack of canceled checks. Copies of invoices with her name on them. Correspondence from the early years, proving she had been an active, visible partner. 30 years of evidence kept in a closet in Savannah by a woman who told herself she was keeping it because she might need it someday. But who knew, I think, that throwing it away would mean admitting what happened to her didn't matter. I never did anything with these, she said. I told myself it was because I'd moved on. She paused. Her hands were flat on the table, on either side of the box, and they were still. The truth is, I was afraid no one would believe me. I looked at Helen Hale, 62 years old, a bookkeeper in Savannah, a woman who had been erased from her own company, her own family, her own brother's memory, and who had kept the proof in a fireproof box for 30 years because the proof was the only thing that said she had been real. Would you be willing to record a video? I asked. Telling your story. On camera. In your own words. Helen was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was still. I could hear a clock ticking somewhere in the house, and the distant sound of a lawnmower on the next block, and the ice settling in my glass of tea. Will you be there when he sees it? She asked. You can be there yourself, I said, if you want. Something moved across her face, not anger, not grief, something older than both. Something that had been sitting in a box for 30 years alongside the checks and the contracts and the proof that she existed. She looked at me and I looked at her, and we were two women at a kitchen table in Savannah who had never met before this morning but who had been living the same story in different decades. Written by the same man in the same handwriting with the same ending, except this time the ending was going to be different. Yes, Helen said, I think I would like that. We set up my phone on a stack of books on her kitchen table, angled so the light from the window fell across her face without casting shadows. Helen sat in her chair, her hands folded, her back straight, and she spoke for 14 minutes without stopping. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She told the truth the way a woman tells it when she has been rehearsing in silence for 30 years and has finally found a room where the acoustics are right. When she finished, I stopped the recording and set the phone down. Helen looked at me. How long until he sees it? She asked. Soon, I said, but not yet. There are a few more things that need to happen first. Helen nodded. She understood patience. She had been practicing it for 3 decades. I drove back to Atlanta that evening with the video on my phone and the photograph back in my bag and Helen's fireproof box in the trunk of my car, and the whole drive home I kept hearing her voice, steady and unhurried, saying the word freeloader the way you say the name of a disease you survived, not with bitterness, with precision. 8 days after the party, a certified letter arrived at the house in Lawrenceville. Russell told me how it happened. He spoke slowly, the way he always did when the facts were doing work that didn't need commentary. The letter came with the regular mail. Gordon opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten dinner every night for 15 years on plates purchased with grocery money that came from my checking account. He expected a bank notice, another overdraft, another bill he didn't understand because he had never understood where the money came from or where it went. It was an eviction notice. Property owner, Vivian Marie Hale. Russell said Gordon read the name once. Then he read it again. Then he read it a 3rd time. And by the 3rd reading, the paper was shaking in his hands and he set it down on the table flat, with both palms pressing it to the wood, like something that might bite him. He called Harold Dempsey his attorney, and Dempsey confirmed what the letter said. The deed was valid. The transfer was legal. The eviction had been properly initiated under Georgia law. 60 days. Gordon's voice, Russell said, had gone very quiet. Not the quiet of a man who is thinking, the quiet of a man who has just discovered that the ground he is standing on belongs to someone else and always has. The voicemails started that afternoon, Gordon first. Not apologetic, not confused, demanding, "What have you done?" As if I had done something, as if the woman who paid his mortgage for 3 years and received a banner that read, "Goodbye a freeloader" in return, was the one who had committed an act. His voice on the recording had the cadence of command, the same voice he used at the podium, but underneath it there was a vibration, thin and high, like a wire pulled too tight. Then Connie, crying. "Vivian, I don't understand what's happening. Please call me. Please just explain." Then Brooke, furious. "You're stealing the house. You know that, right? You're stealing our house." I listened to each voicemail in order, sitting at my kitchen table in Decatur with a notepad and a pen. I wrote down the time of each call, the duration, and one line summarizing the content. I forwarded all 3 recordings to Russell. I did not call any of them back. That same week, Russell sent a second letter. Not to my family. To the Whitfield family attorney, a man named Greenberg who worked out of a firm in Buckhead that handled clients who measured their reputation in generations. The letter was a courtesy notification regarding an ongoing credit fraud investigation involving Brooke Hale. It included a summary of the unauthorized charges, the formal fraud report filed with the credit bureau, and a note that the matter was under active review. Russell didn't tell me what happened next. He didn't have to. Within 24 hours, Margot Whitfield called Tyler. I know this because Brooke's Instagram went quiet that evening, and by the next morning she had removed "engaged" from her profile. Tyler called her once. Then he changed his number. The engagement was over before Brooke understood what had ended it. She had spent 3 years building a narrative that painted me as the family parasite, and the first person to pull the thread was not me, but a woman she had never met sitting in a Buckhead office, reading a letter about credit fraud committed in the name of the woman Brooke had called a freeloader. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea that went cold while I wasn't drinking it. Diana texted, "You okay?" I wrote back, "I will be." Then, "Don't upload it yet. I'll tell you when." Her reply was one word, "understood." A few minutes later, a second text from Helen. "I booked my flight. I'll be there Thursday." I read it twice. I set the phone down on the table next to the photograph from the filing cabinet, which I'd propped against the kitchen window so it caught the morning light. Hale and Hale, day 1. 2 women from different decades of the same man's story. Neither of us alone anymore. Gordon came to my apartment on a Thursday afternoon. I heard him before I saw him. The pounding came through the door like his voice had come through the microphone at the party, loud and certain, and completely unaware of how small it sounded from the other side. I opened the door with the chain on. Through the gap I could see his face, and the first thing I noticed was that he was smaller than I remembered. Not thinner. Smaller, as if something structural had shifted, something behind the posture and the sport coat and the set of his shoulders. "Fix this," he said, and his voice shook, not with anger, with the tremor of a man who has built his entire life on a version of himself that no longer fits. "Sit down," I said. I closed the door, unlatched the chain, and opened it again. He walked in and stood in my kitchen and looked around with the eyes of a person who has never taken a room seriously, at the small table, the second-hand couch, the window that stuck. I pulled out a chair for him. He sat. I opened the manila envelope. The clasp finally gave after weeks of being fastened, and the sound it made was small and metallic and final. I placed the documents on the table one at a time, the property deeds first, the auto payment records second, 3 years of monthly transfers, each one time-stamped, each one traceable to my account, the credit fraud report third, with Brooke's name on every page, the bank statements fourth, showing the balance of the account that had funded his life, an account he had never known existed. Last, I placed the family separation agreement on the table, the document he had asked me to sign at the party, in front of 150 people, with a pen from his jacket pocket. Russell had reviewed it, unenforceable. But the fact that he had demanded it publicly, in front of witnesses while Diana's phone was recording, was something Russell said might matter later, in the kind of proceeding where pattern of behavior carried weight. I said nothing while my father read. I let the paper speak. It had been speaking for 3 years. He just hadn't been listening. Gordon picked up the bank statements first. His eyes moved down the columns, and I watched him do the math he had never done. The same math I had done alone in my kitchen the night of the party. $4,600 a month. 36 months. The number that had glowed on my phone screen now sat in front of him in black and white, and I could see the moment it landed, because his hands stopped moving and his jaw tightened and something behind his eyes shifted from anger to something he had no practice feeling. "These are fake," he said. I said nothing. "You set me up." Louder now, the volume rising like it did at the podium, reaching for the register that had always worked before. I said nothing. "We can work this out." Quieter. A different gear. "You're still my daughter." I waited. And then he said the sentence I had been waiting for, the one I knew would come, because I had been listening to it in different forms my entire life. "After everything I did for you." She. I looked at my father across the kitchen table in my one-bedroom apartment in Decatur. The apartment I paid for with money I earned at a job I worked while subsidizing his mortgage and his car insurance and his business property and his electricity, and I said, "Name one thing. One thing you did for me that I did not pay for." Gordon opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The refrigerator hummed. The afternoon light from the window moved across the table between us, touching the edge of the bank statements. The silence lasted long enough that I could hear a car door close on the street below. It was the first honest moment we had shared in years. And it came not from words, but from their absence, from the space where a father's answer should have been and wasn't, because there was no answer, because he had never done a single thing for me that I had not funded, facilitated, or forgiven. Then the door buzzed. Brooke. She must have tracked Gordon's phone because nobody had given her my address. She came in already talking, already mid-sentence, as if the conversation had started without her and she was catching up by volume. She saw the documents on the table. She saw the credit fraud report with her name. Her mouth closed, then opened again. "You're tearing this family apart," she said. I looked at my sister, 27 years old, wearing a blouse she'd charged to my credit line. "I funded this family for 3 years," I said. "You stole from me for 17 months. And you made a banner calling me a freeloader. I let a beat pass. Tell me who tore what apart." Brooke had no answer. For the first time in 3 years, her story had no audience willing to believe it. Then came the knock I had been expecting least and dreading most. Soft. Tentative. The knock of someone who had been standing outside the door deciding whether to come in. Connie stood in the doorway. She looked at the scene. Her husband at the table, hunched over papers that proved he owned nothing. Her younger daughter standing by the counter with a credit fraud report hanging over her like a sentence. Documents everywhere. Something moved across my mother's face, and it was not a performance. For a moment, just a moment, I saw the woman underneath the silence. She opened her mouth, and whatever she was about to say, it was not a deflection. I could tell because her face looked frightened rather than careful, and my mother's face was never frightened. Careful was her whole life. Then Gordon said her name, just her name, Connie, and my mother closed her mouth. The fear went back behind the careful. Her hands went still at her sides. "Vivian, please," she said. Not a plea for forgiveness, a plea for the old world. "You knew," I said. "You knew I was paying for everything. You knew the banner was a lie, and you sat there." My mother's hands trembled. She did not deny it. She could not. "You can leave now," I said. Connie turned and walked down the hall. She did not look back. Neither did I. The apartment was quiet. Gordon sat at the table. Brooke stood by the counter. The documents lay between them like a map of everything they had taken and everything they had lost. "There is one more thing," I said. I opened my laptop on the kitchen counter and pressed play. The screen filled with a face neither of them had seen in decades. Silver hair. Southern. 62 years old. Calm in a way that had been purchased with 30 years of silence. "My name is Helen Hale," the woman on the screen said. 31 years ago, my brother Gordon and I started a company together. Gordon's body went rigid in the chair. Not the rigidity of anger, something older. The posture of a man hearing a name he thought he had buried so deep it would never come back up. The video played for 14 minutes. Helen described everything: the partnership, the equal equity, the slow marginalization. The clients told she was just helping out. The contracts her name was removed from. The family meetings she was excluded from. The word. The same word. Freeloader. Helen said it without raising her voice. She said it the way a doctor names a condition. Factual. Precise. And in the kitchen in Decatur, Gordon Hale watched his own history play back at him from a face he had spent 3 decades erasing. When the video ended, I closed the laptop halfway. She kept the partnership contract, I said. Every canceled check. 31 years. Then there was a knock at the door. I opened it, and Helen was standing there. Real. Whole. Present. She had flown in from Savannah that morning and taken a cab from the airport and stood outside my door for 10 minutes, listening to the video of her own voice playing through the wall, before she knocked. She told me that later. She said she needed to hear herself say it in a room where Gordon was sitting before she could walk into the room herself. She stepped inside. She looked at Gordon. She crossed the kitchen and sat down across from him at the table in the chair I had been sitting in, and she folded her hands the way she had folded them in the video. And she looked at her younger brother with an expression that contained everything and demanded nothing. "You did it again, Gordon," she said. 4 words. The whole room heard 30 years in them. Brooks stood frozen by the counter. Gordon sat at the table with his hands flat on the documents and his mouth slightly open, and he did not speak because there was nothing in his entire vocabulary built for this moment. He had prepared for lawyers. He had prepared for arguments. He had not prepared for his sister sitting across from him in a kitchen in Decatur, looking at him with the calm, wrecked patience of a woman who has been waiting for a very long time to say his name in a room where he could hear it. Helen looked at me, and something passed between us that did not need words. The look of a woman seeing someone she wished she could have warned. 10 days later, I sent Diana a text. 2 words. Upload it. The timing was precise. The family was already financially exposed, the eviction notices served, the credit fraud report filed, the partnership claim in motion, the video Diana had recorded at the party Gordon's speech, the banner Brooke nodding along Connie, looking at her hands, me walking out without a word. Went up that evening on a channel Diana managed for a friend of a friend, and within 72 hours it had been viewed 8 million times. The comment sections became a jury. And then someone found Helen's story, because the internet always finds the pattern, and the pattern was this. Gordon Hale had used the word freeloader to erase 2 women who built the floors he stood on 30 years apart. The internet does not forgive patterns. His contracting business lost its last 3 clients within a week. His attorney advised him to settle everything quietly. The IRS opened an inquiry into the original property transfers. Russell filed the partnership accounting and dissolution action on Helen's behalf, and Gordon's legal team told him what Russell had told me weeks earlier: he could not fight on 3 fronts. The property, the IRS, the partnership. He chose the only option left. He let go. Helen received a settlement representing her original equity share plus 30 years of back distributions. She did not take the whole company. She took what had always been hers. The rest collapsed on its own, because there had never been much holding it up beyond the money I was sending and the story Gordon was telling, and both of those were gone now. Brooke's social media accounts went private the day the video hit 2 million views. Tyler Whitfield unfollowed every Hale within a week. My mother went to stay with a cousin in Alabama. She called me once. I didn't answer. The voicemail said, "I should have said something. I know that now. I saved it. I did not call back, but I saved it, because it was the first true sentence my mother had spoken to me in 3 years, and even though it arrived too late to change anything, it deserved to exist. Some truths do, even when they can't fix what they name." 2 weeks after the settlement, I drove to Savannah. I brought the photograph. Hale and Hale, day 1. Helen took it from me at her kitchen table and held it for a long time, running her thumb along the edge the way you touch something you lost so long ago that finding it doesn't feel like getting it back. It feels like proof that it was ever real. "I forgot I was smiling," she said. I asked her what she was going to do with the settlement money. She looked out the window at her garden, at the azaleas and the daylilies, and she said, "Something I should have done 30 years ago, whatever I want." We sat in her garden that afternoon. The daylilies were blooming, and the air smelled like warm earth and something sweet I couldn't name, and neither of us said much because there wasn't much left to say. Two women from different decades of the same man's pattern, sitting in white rocking chairs in Savannah, Georgia, watching the light change on a garden that one of them had tended for 30 years while waiting for someone to knock on her door. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment in Decatur. The light came through the kitchen window at the angle it always did in early summer, warm and thin, landing on the counter where the coffee maker sat. I made coffee. I drank it standing at the window. My phone was on the table. No missed calls, no voicemails, no notifications. The first quiet morning in weeks. Diana texted at 8:15. "Breakfast?" 20 minutes, I wrote back. I looked around my apartment. Small, quiet, the second-hand couch. The window that stuck if you didn't lift it at an angle. The photograph of Hale and Hale, day one, propped against the kitchen window where it had been since the night I brought it home from the filing cabinet. And next to it, a new photograph. One Diana had taken in Helen's garden 2 weeks ago. Helen and me, sitting in the rocking chairs, not posing, not performing, just two women in a garden who had found each other on the other side of something that was supposed to erase them. I picked up my bag and walked out the door. The street was ordinary. The morning was ordinary. I was not the same person who had driven to Lawrenceville 3 months ago with a manila envelope in her bag and a plan she couldn't name. That woman had needed a party to stop hoping. This one had stopped hoping and started something else, something that didn't have a word yet, but felt like the first morning after a long illness, when you can't quite remember what healthy felt like, but you can feel it starting. I did not destroy them. I just stopped pretending their house was my home.